Hello, everyone. This is Chris Morris, the Faith Formation Director at Holy Family Catholic Church in Orange, and welcome to this talk on Catholic religious orders, their origins, their evolution, their impact. This is a huge topic, so cramming this into under an hour is a little difficult. So I hope to give you enough meat to really inspire you to dig in further, and I'll give you a couple of great references that can help you do that at the end. This is actually one of our parish's Elevate series talks. The way Elevate works is members of the parish nominate different topics around which a talk will be built. All those nominations are put together and then voted on, and the top 10 get delivered each new season of Elevate. We're currently in season 8, so we've got 70 of these in the bank so far, and we'll see where we go with the 10 this season. The first one up I just recorded a short while ago is around exorcists and exorcism. So you can see the topics can be quite diverse. And this is number 2 for season 8, Catholic religious orders. So let's begin in prayer. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, I'm always thanking you for the great gifts you give us in the liturgy and the sacraments. And I want to thank you especially for the great gifts that the religious orders have proven to be in the history of our church and really of Western civilization. And hopefully over the course of the next 45 to 55 minutes or so, I can convey the power, give me the grace to convey the power that the orders have had and the impact that they have had, and help us all to pray for these men and women that choose to dedicate their lives so fully to you and so fully to the construction of your kingdom, and really for the salvation of the whole world. And we thank you again for them, and we ask you to bless each and every one of them. Amen. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So yeah, there's a lot here. Okay, we're gonna try to cover it as quickly as I can, and hopefully it will satisfy your curiosity and inspire you to dig deeper. So we're going to start just with defining what a religious order is. There are many people that are like, yeah, what are they talking about? Okay, when they talk about that. What are some of the key terms relative to religious orders? And we'll highlight them. And for those of you that actually participate in the live session, I'm just contemplating now. I'll be giving out detailed notes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going too deep on those. We're going to then talk about the origins of religious orders and then kind of go through a very, brief history of how they've evolved over 2,000 years, and just end with just a single note, a single, slide on, what their impact has been at a very high level. And again, I think just even at that level, it's magnificent, and it'll inspire you to dig deeper and support the orders, and to potentially consider becoming a portion or a part of one yourself, which as lay men and women you can do, or as someone who will dedicate their life to the order, you can do as a religious brother or sister. So let us get going. So what is a religious order? Pretty simple. It's a community of men and women or both. They take solemn vows. These are the vows, the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So they are giving up all material possessions. They are going to live chaste lives, which in this state of life means, a life of no sexual activity whatsoever. And obedience to their superior, their abbot, their prior, their prioress, to the head of their order, but complete obedience to those that have been given the authority for that order. They dedicate their lives to growing closer to God. All of them. Okay. That is a almost single-minded focus for all orders. However, right there alongside that is helping to build God's kingdom, and there's 2 approaches to that. There's one just through a life of contemplation and prayer. Every day, the contemplative orders are out there praying on behalf of the world. They are praying for the good of the church. They're praying for the good of humanity. they are asking God to continuously give us the grace we need to overcome our own weaknesses. They are out there um, doing everything possible from the spiritual side to help the kingdom become a reality, and for us to thrive in this kingdom. And then there's others that will use the skills they have, the charisms they have, on a more active level to directly help in the material world, the construction of God's kingdom on earth. So I like to contrast it as you have the Marys and you have the Marthas. Okay, the Marys are very much contemplative, prayer oriented, dedicated their life to God, but in a very spiritual, deep spiritual connection. Where the Marthas, dedicated their life to God, have that spiritual connection. Certainly, deep prayer is a huge portion of their life, but they've also chosen to dedicate a portion of their lives in a very active way, using the charisms, the skills they have, to better serve the kingdom of God and help others directly come to it. So that is important. Members of religious orders are not clergy necessarily. Okay, as a matter of fact, early on, as you're going to find out, it was unusual for there to be clergy in the orders. Now it's much more common. As a matter of fact, you would say in many orders, they're dominated by priests who are religious priests as opposed to I don't like to say secular priests, but diocesan priests, priests that live out in the world. These are religious priests that lives, often separate from the world, and are not specifically associated with a diocesan bishop, although there is a connection naturally to the bishop, depending upon where that order happens to make its home. Again, they can't be deacons or priests. They don't have to be, but again, many are dominated by deacons, priests, at least the male orders. These orders are distinct from religious confraternities, which are something else, lay and clerical congregations, which are also something else, clerical secular institutes, and societies for apostolic life, which may take simple vows or sometimes solemn vows, and embrace different forms of communal living, but they're not the orders. The orders, are very specific, following specific rules, solemn vows, a little bit more segregated from the world to a lot more segregated from the world. So there's a difference between these different religious organizations. The confraternities, the lay and clerical congregations, the clerical secular institutes, and societies for apostolic life are very popular now in the 20th and 21st century and have really exploded, where religious orders, had dominated for most of the first 2,000 years of Catholic religious life. So some of the key terms, let's start with the isms: asceticism, Hermeticism, also known as Hermetism. I'm going to mess this up. Coenobitism, it's supposed to be a hard C, so Cenobitism, some people say Cenobitism. I'm just butchering it, deal with it. And then monasticism. So, asceticism is, saying, hey, I'm going to practice a significant prayer life that includes self-denial and penance and, some fairly significant penance that I'm going to do things that really disconnect me completely from the material world, allow me to show and demonstrate my dedication to God, and allow me to live as simple as possible a life as can be. Hermeticism is then taking that ascetic lifestyle and moving it to the next level and saying, I'm going to do this in isolation. So hermits will live completely secluded from the civilized world if they can, get as far away as possible. It's a dedication to God through solitude, by removing any possible distraction that one could have in their pursuit of relationship with God. Coenobitism, man, I should really use my app to get the pronunciation of that one correctly. It's sort of Hermeticism, solitude, in community, if that makes any sense. It's saying, hey, let's still practice this high level of solitude and separation from the material world, but let's kind of do it together, so we can pool some of our resources and talents, to make our life easier, a day-to-day life easier, so we have even more time to dedicate to God. So it's an interesting evolution, isolation and community. And then monasticism, is fully embracing community and brotherhood and pursuit of a specific way of life, as community. And again, that could be either of the Martha variety or the Mary variety, of either Mary in terms of the contemplative religious life, or Martha in terms of the active religious life. The places these isms are practiced, well, you can, start with the cell, okay? Hermits will find a place to live, a cell, a very simple, in the case of hermits, often not even a structure as much as a cave, but a simple structure. A hermitage would be what they would call it if it was a structure. But a cell generally is part of a monastery. But the same idea, simple structure with the basics that you would need to live a very simple life. Okay, so you're not talking about anything elaborate. You're talking about rough. You're talking about baseline, bottom line needs. I have a place for a bedroll or a bed of some form. Maybe I have a cabinet, a desk that I can do work at and study at, and that's basically it. Then you have monasteries, which are composed of cells and also generally have a central chapel. They actually, have centralized workspaces or workshops, or in the case of, those monks who did a lot of copying, they could have a copy room, okay, a scriptorium, as they say. But a monastery is a collection of cells, usually enclosed, with a central chapel, perhaps a central dining area, maybe a library, or resource center, and if there are, a centralized workspace. An abbey is a monastery on steroids. So an abbey is going to be built around a centralized church, may have multiple cellular buildings, could even have multiple cloisters, which is our next word, contained within it. A cloister is, an enclosed and isolated space within the monastery, but certainly within the abbey. You could have a cloister for female religious and a cloister for male religious. So abbey is just a larger, more elaborate version of a monastery. When I say elaborate, it doesn't mean more rich or detailed or what have you. But it may have more of the things of a monastery the monastery has, have it on a larger scale, and be more likely to house a larger group of religious men or women. Again, the cloister is an isolated living space. It can be part of a monastery or an abbey. For example, you could go visit an abbey or a monastery, and you as an outsider may be able to visit certain elements of the monastery or abbey, but you would not be allowed into the cloister. The cloister is reserved for those religious brothers and sisters that are living in isolation, separate from the world, and that is not a place where lay people would be allowed to go. Convent, just, nunnery, convent. Strangely enough, you can have convents for men or for women. It's just another name for the living space of religious. Friary, a little bit different. Friary, again, another name for living space of religious. Difference here is a friary is generally associated with an active world. So friary is a house for friars, which are the mendicant orders, generally are friars. These guys are going to be more active, so the friaries are likely to be located in a central living space, so within a city itself. So where a monastery and abbey are going to be isolated and outside of the city and or outside of the civilized world, so to speak, a friary and even a convent can exist, or more often will exist within the bounds of a city, within the bounds of a town. So an hermit, someone who has dedicated their life to God, taken those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, although their obedience is to God and God alone. They live by themselves. They believe that isolation will allow them to rise to a greater level of connection to God without any worldly distractions whatsoever. It is a life of prayer, a life of work, a life of trying to get deeper and deeper into that relationship and connection to God. A monk is someone, male, who live in a monastery, so a communal life, also dedicated to God, but dedicated to God through community. Nun, usually the name that we give to religious sisters, but religious sisters works just as well. Canon regular, these would be priests that are associated with a specific cathedral or collegiate church. They are called canons. So over time, they not only would serve a specific cathedral or collegiate church, they would at times form orders and then for it to be known as canon regular. So a little different than monks because they're all priests. They're all on the road to being priests. But they're known as canon regulars, and it started with their association with large churches, which we'll go into a little bit. Abbot or canonist, superior. I notice I don't have prior or prioress on here. I should probably add those. These are all, as a matter of fact, I'm going to. Let's pause. Gotta love technology. You can make a change on the fly. So, prior, prioress, superior. These are all the people that are looked to, and depending upon the order and the rule which they follow, are looked to for leadership. These are the people to whom you will be obedient when you take your vows in a monastic life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So again, I don't want to say they're the management team of the orders, but they are the ones usually elected by the members of the orders themselves, looked to as people that people want to be led by. So think of them as the leaders, think of them as the spiritual and organizational leaders of their orders. They're there to help people excel at this life that they've dedicated themselves to and move from there. Then you have clerics and cleric regulars. We're going to talk a little bit about them when we talk about the Jesuits, okay, because they are certainly an example of clerks or clerics regular. Again, always a clergy. So you're talking deacons, priests, some bishops as well. Again, they generally, from a religious order perspective, are out there actively serving as priests. Again, different from diocesan priests, different from canon regulars, who are also priests for the most part. But cleric regular, again, part of a religious order like the Jesuits, or the prime example, very active, very missionary, very much not isolated and contemplative and associated with the monastery, but now more actively living in the world themselves, and deliberately choosing to be on mission. Okay, so again, very, very different approach than a monk. And then a friars, again, usually associated with the mendicant orders. The mendicant orders are those that have really embraced poverty to an extreme. Starting with Francis, the extreme being that, you have nothing and only take what's given to you. That is an extreme. So friars, the mendicants, have really embraced that portion of Christ's discipleship where you have nowhere to lay your head unless it's given to you. You have no money, no goods, just what's on your back, if anything's on your back at all. And again, you generally will call these men and women friars or nuns, or sisters, but friar is the typical term for men. How these people live? Well, they live according to rules, and then when you see rules, you're all used to rules, don't cross the street except at designated crosswalks, blah blah blah. But a rule is a series of rules and guidelines that the people that enter these orders agree to live by. And these are rules. Some of them are quite ancient, going all the way back to most people know the rule of Saint Benedict, but it predates Benedict. You can go back as far as Augustine in the 4th and 5th century, or farther back than that. You can go to Basil the Great in the 4th century, and farther back than that, Pachomius, who really created the first. I'm going to butcher it again. The order with the C. Coenobetic order, and his simple rule, his angelic rule, might be something that an order picks. And again, this will describe all aspects of religious life. How we're going to work, how we're going to pray, how we're going to eat, how we're going to exercise, what type of work we're going to do. It really orders every element of their daily life. And it's a rule that you commit to living by, and this is one of the ways that people will actually select an order. They'll look at both charism and they'll look at their rule of life and see if that rule of life can is something that they see themselves thriving in. You have contemplative orders and active orders. I think I've discussed that already. The mendicant orders, taking the vow of extreme poverty, carrying nothing, owning nothing, which, as it turns out, it's not possible to really do in the real world, but at least the Franciscans have made a valid attempt at it, but they've made concessions because you do eventually have to have something if you're going to actually, especially be an active order. You need at least a place to be active in. So cloistered, isolated, again, a large number of these religious brothers and sisters choose this very cloistered and isolated life. Probably one of the greatest examples today. There is one of these monasteries here in the United States in Vermont, are the Carthusians, which take this to an extreme. They're monasteries in the middle of nowhere. But it's not just that you cannot go visit. Lay people who aren't connected to the order cannot go there. They do not interact with the real world in any real sense. No electronic media or news. They are completely isolated. So, and they live a lifetime that way. And it's actually quite impressive. So impressive. The more I read about them, I decided to donate some money to them, because I just can't believe that they continue to do this and have done it the same way for 900 years. So, and then you have embedded orders that are embedded within the real world. And this is becoming more and more the norm, not necessarily with the strict term of orders, but really with some of these new groups and religious opportunities that have risen in the 19th, 20th, 21st century. That we will talk about in a little bit. So where did they come from? Well, there have been religious brothers and sisters as long as there's been religion, and Christianity was, not the first religion by any stretch of the imagination. So, people had always been drawn to isolation and community in seeking God, or their version of God, of deepening their spirituality, of getting away from the material world. So we've been complaining about the material world and its ability to corrupt as long as there's been humans. And so getting away from that material world, seeking to isolate yourself from that corruption, as something that definitely predates the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and one or two branches of Hinduism. So again, this is nothing new. As a matter of fact, if you look at our direct spiritual ancestors, the Jewish people, there were actually Jewish sects, for example, the Essenes, who did form isolated communities with this intention of, let's get away from the corruption of the city. So in this case, let's get away from the corruption that has seeped into Jerusalem and the religious hierarchy, and form our own isolated communities where we have certain rules which we will live by, and dedicate our lives to. So again, this is nothing new. And then aesthetics, that lifestyle that is focused on self-denial and abstention from worldly pleasures. Again, that actually goes beyond religion and the search for God. It goes into just the search for the greatest version of self. So these are not new forms of life. They've existed as long as humanity has existed in any sort of organized form. And certainly, it gave Christianity quite a bit to draw upon. What else it's drawing upon, of course, is Scripture itself. And we all know this story, this desire that you see over and over again in the Gospels of people who Christ has impacted who want to follow him. Some he called, some ended up becoming followers. You can think of someone like Mary Magdalene. Others wanted to be followers, and he turned them down for one reason or another. And a great example of that's the rich young man in this passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. And behold, one came up to him saying, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And he said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? One there is who is good. If you would enter life, keep the commandments," he said to him. "Which?" And Jesus said, "You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "All these I've observed. What do I still lack?" And Jesus said to him, "If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." A pretty significant direction right there. So give up everything in your material life. Use the proceeds to benefit those that are struggling, and come follow me. In this case, when the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, where he had so many possessions, or he had great possessions and was loath to give them up. So think about that for a moment. So what you're really seeing here is Jesus laying out the vision of religious life, of dedicating yourself completely to God and freeing yourself from any material corruptions, or at least attempting to. So again, the rich young man is not one that could do it. Not all are called to religious life. Some are not. And in this case, it's almost as if Jesus was trying to point this out to the rich young man, that he isn't a person who was called, and he still had a lot of spiritual growth to do. And maybe at some point he may be called, but not at this point in his life. And then, this desire to live as the early Christians lived has always been out there. We get this great description of early Christian life, the early Christian community, in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, where it says, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of the bread and the prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they sold their possessions and goods and distributed them to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they partook of food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." So you see the basic outline of communal living here. They're dedicating themselves to the sacred scripture, and community life, and the celebration of the Eucharist and the prayers. I could have just described any of a number of religious orders right there. They had all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods and distributed them to all. Very common in a religious order. You give up everything and your possessions, and the out or the net result of the sale of your possessions could just be handed right over to the order for common use. And day by day, attending the temple, attending structured religious prayer, breaking the bread, blah blah blah. So again, you see very early in the church this evolution of strict communal life, of a life dedicated to God, and the growth of the church. Very early on, in the earliest days of the church, we certainly weren't known as Christians. We were thought to be another Jewish religious sect, but very early on, a name that was given to the early Christians were the people of the way. And what that was referring to is the way of how they lived their lives. They lived their lives for each other, very, sacrificially, very aesthetically, very much living and trying to live as disciples of Christ, living a life modeled for us by Him. So the way is really what was that first move towards religious orders. Could you commit yourself to the way? Obviously, it was not possible for all, okay, or even the majority, right? So I don't want you to have the impression that everyone lived through the way in the early church. It's not the case. But you see that through the evolution of the way that you actually see the foundations of what were to become the early religious orders. So the story of religious orders, one, it's a story of extreme growth. This is the story we're about to cover in detail. It's also a story of corruption and decay, which tends to happen with extreme growth. You find extreme growth, you find with growth comes wealth and ego and all sorts of things that can undermine you, especially in this world. So you have corruption, you have decay, you have reform, you have rebirth, and you see the religious orders going through these cycles multiple times, especially the oldest of the orders. It's also a story of constant change and new forms. So it wasn't as if religious orders popped out and this was it, and we cookie cuttered them from one to the next. They're very different. They evolved to meet the needs of the world and the church at different times in history, and they continue to evolve and change over time as those needs evolve and change in the real world. And what you see is just a massive variation of spiritualities and charisms and services. Yes, a lot of commonalities in the high level view of way of life, even commonalities and rules. Various orders have adopted the same rules, yet they are very different in how they live their lives. So even shows you that the rules are pretty flexible to allow some vastly different orders to follow the same basic rule structure, yet actually live out in a very different way from another order that is based on that same rule structure. So it's an interesting story, to say the least. So let's start digging into that evolution. So this is a great statement from one of our great saints. Okay, by the development of his spiritual powers, a man discovers a completely new world that external realities have obscured / hidden. Alone with God, a man can better seek communion through constant prayer, which often leads to mystical ecstasy. So alone with God, we're definitely talking about a hermit here. We're talking about a spiritual master. We're talking about Anthony of the Desert. And, that's really where the evolution of orders that we see today starts. It actually starts with Anthony of the Desert and Hermeticism. So Anthony was incredibly inspired by the story of the rich young man and heard that gospel proclaimed during Mass and took it to heart and took, whatever the celebrant's homily was, must have been pretty powerful, because Anthony left saying, I need to do this, because he was quite well off. So he did. He sold all and gave to the poor, just held a little bit behind to make sure that his sister would be taken care of for life. But other than that, Anthony did. Anthony, sold off all of his considerable assets. And this was following the death of his parents when he inherited those assets. Um, and moved outside the city to the woods and built himself a little hermitage and tried to dedicate himself to this life. So here we are in the 3rd century into the 4th century. Anthony is really seeking a deeper way, a deeper connection to God, and it kind of makes sense if you understand the history of what was happening. So we went from that early church where they're practicing the way, and also in doing so, we're practicing a lifestyle that could get them killed. So early church, we had persecutions by the Roman Empire, and let's not get crazy, they weren't constant. It wasn't as if the majority of Christians were killed through these persecutions, but the risk was certainly there. So what you had people becoming Christians or adopting Christian beliefs for nothing but the right reasons, because you were indeed risking your life to do this. And then there would be periods of difficult persecution, and you were well aware of this, but you had to be convinced this was true. You had to be convinced that this was the only way through salvation, because people simply don't take these kind of risks, and it certainly was a risk. Then you have in 313 Constantine, who is the Western Roman emperor, one of the Western Roman emperors, gets together with the other, and they release the Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity. This is in 313. So right in the middle of Anthony's life here, Christianity is legalized, and that takes a lot of the pressure off people. Now it's like, well, I can become Christian now because I don't actually have that much danger, okay, of being killed anymore, because now the religion is legal. Matter of fact, by the time you get to Theodosius I in 380, well, it's more than legal. It's now become named the official religion of the empire. So a lot happened in that period where Anthony evolved, and one of the reasons that he may have evolved is, just being Christian at one point was dedicating your life fully to God, because your life could be forfeit at any point. Once that risk was eliminated, there was no substitute. And that's where you see Hermeticism start to rise, starting with Anthony and others who were looking for a deeper commitment than you could possibly give just by being Christian. Right. So in some ways, the legalization and eventually the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the empire led to Hermeticism, or the embracement of that, and that ends up serving as the foundation of the religious orders, right? Then you have the modification. So Pachomius, again, his life overlapped quite a bit with Anthony in Desert. He was a hermit at one point, but he is the one who was given a vision and given a rule of life called the angelic rule. He claims to have had an angel visit him and give him this. And really, he created what you could consider the first monastery, which was a bunch of hermits still living in isolation, but doing it near each other. Okay. And then next thing you know, we have a wall around us. And the idea was, by combining their skills, they could spend less time just on basic survival, which if you're living all by yourself, you spend most of your day on basic survival, and more time in prayer and seeking a higher spiritual plane. So Pachymonius's rule, instituted Coenobitism, and this is that halfway point between Hermeticism and monasticism. So you get that right around the same time, and overlapping quite significantly with our friend Anthony. Then Basil the Great comes along. So we don't, here in the Western Church, we don't give Basil the credit that he is due. But he actually comes along, champion of orthodoxy. If it wasn't for Basil and his brother Gregory and their friend Gregory, the final death blow to Arianism may not have been delivered at the Second Ecumenical Council, Constantinople I, in 380. So again, Basil was huge player in the church in the early years. Spent a lot of time visiting monasteries, and eventually, joined one, only to then later form one of his own. Okay, and the idea, again, this whole idea of living isolated in community, in a way that you could, give your life to God and help build the kingdom of God on earth. This was a very attractive vision, still attractive vision. And he put together, a significant rule. It's a long rule, okay? 55 chapters with 313 summary rules. And this rule of life, this rule for living the monastic life, is still the dominant rule in the Eastern Catholic Church. So that's how powerful this was. It's one of the oldest purely monastic rule sets, and it still dominates in the East, okay? Again, one of the key elements of his rule, beyond that dedication to prayer and the breaking of the bread and poverty and chastity, was also one of intellectual development. So Basil wrote into his rule the need to constantly study and grow in knowledge and understanding and ability to convey the faith. So he's one of the first ones to move in that direction in his rule set. And his rule set, again, is probably the oldest contiguous in-use rule set in the Catholic world. People tend to think it's Benedict. That's only because we have very much our Western bias hats on, and we see Benedict as the dominant rule in the West and assume that's the oldest. But really, it would have to be Basil the Great as a pure monastic rule set. Now, in fact, even in the West, you could argue that Augustine preceded Benedict. So, Augustine, who lived in the mid fourth to the early fifth centuries, he's actually one who, never intended to be a priest. So we know that the gentleman that baptized him, Ambrose, was drafted into the priesthood and bishopric and went on to be, one of our greatest saints ever. And Augustine, clearly one of our greatest saints, also, strangely enough, was adopted into the priesthood. So he wanted to live the monastic life and actually had done so. But what they had the practice of doing in and around the area of Hippo in northern Africa is they would poll the people and ask the people to nominate those that seemed to be living a life that would be appropriate for the priesthood, and they ended up nominating Augustine, much to his dismay. And eventually he went from not just being nominated to be a priest, but to being put up for the bishop of the city of Hippo. And he accepted it with one condition, and that's that he could form a monastic life around the priesthood. So he came up with the first rule of Augustine. And it's a rule for canons regular. He basically said, I want all of the men in my diocese to come live with me in the bishop's palace. And what we're going to do here is we are going to live in community while we serve in the world as priests. And quite frankly, that he is the first example, or his monastery there in the bishop's castle was the first example of a canon's regular monastic order. Where we have an example that actually follows the rule of Augustine today nearby. That's the Norbertines. So a group of priests, although you can be lay brothers as well with the Norbertines, but a group of priests at an abbey built around a large central church, where they're engaged in study, they're engaged in spiritual development, certainly the liturgy of the hours, the prayers. However, they go out and serve the community as priests, bringing the liturgy and the sacraments to the Christian world. So again, you have that rule very early on. And as we move to the end of that fifth century, we see the final collapse of the Western Empire, and now the church is the source of order and protection in much of Western Europe. And the monasteries, which are now beginning to grow, are anchor points in Europe, actually providing safe havens and places of education for young men, things of that nature. So we're starting to see that evolve, which gets us to the idea of the rule. All right, and so for an example, these are excerpts of the rule of Benedict, who we're about to encounter. And he believed in a very structured day. So when I say it really rules regulate all aspects of daily life for the orders, they really do. So he had the 4-6-4 breakout, 4 hours committed to Opus Dei, the work of God, the divine office. That's the prayers, the liturgy, the hours. So 4 hours a day in prayer, 6 hours a day focused on work necessary so that the monastery can be self-sustaining. So applying what skills you have to a task that allows the monastery to be self-sustaining, and then 4 hours a day dedicated to intellectual and spiritual development, study, growth, and understanding of the faith, or in some other discipline. And that's a core element of the Benedictine rule that exists to this day. And then, another core element was, your submission to the authority of the abbot. So you're going to commit to a single monastery for your whole life. You're not going to go monastery hopping. You're going to embrace this monastic lifestyle, which means no personal property. So you're taking that vow of poverty, renunciation of any possibility of marriage. You're taking that vow of chastity and obedience. It's obedience to the abbot, not subservience. Subservience means that the abbot is lording over his power and his greatness over you. That's not what we have here. We have an abbot who's providing direction. They are equals in all ways, except that the monk is going to agree to obedience to the abbot, whose job is to take the best possible care, spiritual care of those in the monastery or abbey. All right. And strangely enough, when people think of the vows of chastity, poverty, chastity, and obedience, most modern people think that it's the chastity vow that's the most difficult, and it is not. It really turns out that this obedience is the most difficult for those in religious orders, to really surrender your will to the will of someone else who you've placed trust in. Very difficult thing to do. So that gets us, into this next big block of time. So those first 400 or 500 years, a lot's happening. We have the foundation of the orders. Now we're going to get into the first massive growth spurt. It starts obviously with Benedict, Benedict of Nursia. Nursia, if I'm not mistaken, trying to think, Nursia was in northern Italy. Something tells me that might not be right. Central Italy, okay? So he grew up in Central Italy, and he was very much dedicated to the monastic lifestyle, okay? He started as an hermit, okay, as many of them do, all right? And he really I think it was in the Sabine Hills outside of Rome where his hermitage was. He really embraced the life of a hermit, but he became very popular for his obedience to that dedication to poverty, chastity, and obedience to God in his case, and that isolated lifestyle, and was asked actually by a local monastery if he would come in and be their abbot, if he would come in and set a rule for them, because they were kind of they realized they really didn't have a clear way of life. And so he did. He came in and he set the rule, but his rule was a little bit too rough for this group of men. So they had existed for a while, and when Benedict came in and laid his rule down on them, they're like, "You're out of your mind." Um, so we're not taking that. So they actually tried to poison him to get rid of him. It did not work. He saw through their plan. But he left. He left of his own accord and said, I get it. If this is too much for you, no problem. Eventually, he formed his own order. He realized he wanted to form an order, and he wouldn't be able to do it by taking people from an existing order that already picked up bad habits. So he formed an order and brought them to a location called Monte Cassino in 529. They built a monastery on top of an old temple to Jupiter. He modified his rule a little bit. He took a look at his rule. Maybe it was too harsh. He took a little bit from Pachomius, a little bit from Basil, and a little bit from St. John Cassian, who also had a rule that was not as popular in the East, clearly, as Basil. And he actually put together the rule that we saw or partially saw on the page before, the rule of Benedict. Okay. Now, a lot of people point to this founding of Monte Cassino in the year 529 and the Benedictines as the first true religious order, because we really didn't have a religious order yet. We had Pachomius, who kind of set up a rule for Cenobenic life. You had Basil, who set up rules for monastic life. You had Augustine, who set up a rule for the life of really canons regular. But these spread, but they didn't spread in any connected way. Okay, they were all isolated. Even if they followed the same basic rule, they were isolated. They didn't have any relationship to each other. There wasn't some sort of centralized decision-making body. So you really didn't have any orders yet. A lot of people think Monte Cassino was the beginning of the orders, but by that definition, it's actually not true. Benedict created a rule. Monte Cassino was the first monastery that took on that rule. And then that rule spread, but they were all independent. Matter of fact, Benedict, part of his rule was he wanted each of them to be independent. So again, it wasn't as if you had Benedictines. You had people following the rule of Benedict, okay? And it rapidly spread, okay? So much so that for the next couple of centuries, pretty much every monastery leveraged the rule of Benedict. This would be male and female, by the way. Just explosion of the monastic lifestyle. Again, that rule was pretty basic, easy to follow because it was, 464. That submission and humility and everything to the abbot made sense. It made for harmony within the monastery. It made sure that work was being done. It made sure that personal growth was happening. It made sure that the prayer life was attuned to. And again, even though Monte Cassino was destroyed in 581, so think about this. He sets it up in 529, and a little over 50 years later, it's destroyed by the Lombard invaders. It was a very popular rule. So, what ended up happening is Gregory the Great, the Pope, who was the Pope at the turn of the 6th century into the 7th century, he actually sent people to the United Kingdom, at that time just known as England, through St. Boniface to actually not through Boniface. He sends, who did he send? I'm losing my mind. I'm thinking about maybe it's Augustine of Canterbury. Sends Augustine to Canterbury to England, and he deliberately sends them with the rule of Benedict and said, go out there and set up some monasteries. And they did. Matter of fact, they did very well. Massive number of monasteries were set up basically everywhere in England by within a decade. Okay. And what that allowed to have happen was, eventually St. Boniface comes out of one of those monasteries, returns to the mainland Europe, in the early 8th century. And what he does is he brings the Benedictine rule back to the mainland, all the way into Germany, Italy, then Italy, France, and Spain. So kind of Germany, and then backtracks through Italy, France, and Spain. And all of a sudden, the rule of Benedict is everywhere. And with the crowning of Charlemagne in the year 800 as the Holy Roman Emperor in the West, he was a big proponent of the Benedictine rule, so he gave it imperial support. And all of a sudden, Benedictine monasteries are popping up left and right, and they're getting great support both from the government and from the church, and from the local rich people who see people living this type of life and can't help but admire it and want to help it succeed. So all of a sudden, monasteries are getting massive land grants and just straight donations and gold and silver and what have you. So these groups that chose poverty, chastity, and obedience are actually rapidly becoming massive landholders, with access to quite a bit of material wealth that has been given to them from others who admire their way of life. So it's just funny how that happens, that this austere, this aesthetic way of life actually brought with it a tremendous amount of wealth. And as you know, what happens when you get a tremendous amount of wealth, you eventually get tremendous corruption. And that's what we saw as the 9th century progressed, starting with a change in the rule of Benedict. So you had Benedict II. This would be Benedict of Anane. He actually modifies the rule of Benedict, and he downplays community work. And the reason he downplays community work was so many, of the wealthy were giving them, direct bequeaths and giving them riches and lands, and with the request, hey, will you pray for my family? That there wasn't enough time in the day to continue to pray for all these families and people that had been major donors. So his answer was, well, let's get rid of that 6 hours of work, and we can dedicate more time to prayer. And this also marked the beginning of a change. So up until here, you really had nothing but lay people in the monasteries. But with this influx in money and wealth and requests for intercessory prayers, there's also requests for intercessory masses. And now you needed more priests to actually accommodate the prayer and mass life that they had committed to. So next thing you know, the monastery starts shifting in their demographic, and you get more and more priests being ordained, and more masses said. And all of a sudden, the monasteries, which again have grown and are wealthy, they become the home of the aristocracy. Second and third sons are joining the monastery, and they're bringing servants with them, which is how they were able to give up doing the work of the monastery. They just had their servants do it. So now you have the rich building the monasteries up, and actually the rich becoming some of the main feeder systems into the monastery. You have massive land grants, and all of a sudden you have corruption. And the easing of the rule allowed the corruption to occur. But the corruption was bound to occur with that much money floating around, and really tempting these religious orders. So you have a century where the religious orders start to really decline, not in numbers, but in their focus. Their focus on connection to God and bringing others to God started to dissipate. You really saw this with the female religious orders. The female religious orders became really little more, in many cases, than the place you sent your wife, sister, daughter, niece, for refinement, for protection. Okay. And as a result, the religious sisters became more like social clubs than they did one focused on being focused on God. So they still said their mandatory prayers of the Liturgy of the Hour 7 times a day, but living the life of poverty and chastity was sort of secondary. And very often they were living a pretty high life, and one that wasn't necessarily chaste anymore. So that calls for reform, and reform we did get. Okay, and it starts with the evolution or the the really first emergence of Benedictine orders with a monastery at Cluny. And I'm going to take a break here. We'll pick up with Cluny in just a moment. Okay, let's get back to Cluny. So, Cluny emerges, and this really comes from a land grant from the Duke of Aquitaine in what is today modern day France. A big chunk of his empire, he just gives, which is a mountainous chunk, so there wasn't much value to it from farmland or grazeland perspective. But he gives it to this monastery, but he does it with a condition, and it was really interesting. Obviously, he saw the corruption that was starting to take place, and he says, I want this monastery to be free of the control of the local bishop, which means the local bishop can't put one of his cronies in as the abbot, who could then siphon some of the riches off from the monastery, and also free from local feudal lords, which means that a feudal lord couldn't also name the abbot and treat the monastery just as a vehicle through which he could control land and extract exorbitant rents from the people on the land and things of that nature. So what you end up having is you have a monastery set up by a very rich um, uh, rich gift giver, who had the power to set some rules in place to actually ensure that the monastery would have the best possible chance of avoiding some of the corruption. Okay. Because what he says, I want this monastery to be loyal only to the Pope. And this was a big change. Okay. Because up until then, monasteries being landholders, really, were either allied to themselves or allied to the local bishop or allied to the local feudal lord who would offer them some semblance of protection. And now, all of a sudden, you have a monastery, a very large monastery that is to be built, and its allegiance is to the Pope. And this became the model moving forward. And it became a reform monastery. So it tried to return to the original Benedictine rule. It also set up a structure so that as it expanded, other houses that would be created, other monasteries that would be created using it as a model would actually have connections to the mother house at Cluny. So what you ended up having is you have an affiliation. And this is really where the first Benedictine religious order actually started, because now there is an organizational set. They're not autonomous. I think, within, if I'm not mistaken, by the end of the 10th century, so within 90 years of its founding, there were 37 subject houses or monasteries that worked their way up to Cluny in an organized structure with abbots, and now groups of abbots meeting together to actually, set the structure for the entire community of all these monasteries. And then it erupted, because by the end of the next century, so another 100 years passed, there's more than 1,000 of these Cluny-related monasteries. So really what you have is the first religious order and an explosion at the same time. And this order became massive. So everyone was Benedictine for a while, and everyone was tied to Cluny for a while. They never were able to restore the work. Okay, they still focused on the Opus Dei, the prayers, and it was extended to be about 8 hours of the day, and there was still 4 hours of personal and intellectual and faith development that was expected. And it was very much a focus of all that prayer on prayer for the world outside, really praying for the good of humanity and the good of the church. So there was a strict reform. It became less attractive to the uber rich, because the days of fun and excitement were over. Don't bring your servants with you if you want to join us. But they had enough wealth now accumulated, and usually some great sponsors or advocates who were also wealthy, that they could afford not to do the work of the monastery. The monastery actually would become self-sustaining. It would have its own workforce, and it would be a major landholder, and it would actually collect rents, and that would allow them to pay workers. Okay. to maintain the monastery. So the real focus became purely on prayer, and faith and intellectual development at these monasteries at Cluny. And they also got back to the whole idea of, very diligent, let's work to bring the kingdom of God. Okay. However, as anything, they got so popular that, slowly but surely, these individual 1,000 or so monasteries tied to Cluny started to bring in their own little variations and corruptions, and the world was changing around them. And the secular rulers wanted a greater hand in the running of these monasteries, since they were usually the largest landholders in their domain. So a secular prince would look at his domain and realize a third of it was associated with this monastery. So he had an active interest in making sure he knew who was running that monastery. And again, you started seeing that corruption come into place. Okay. Strangely enough, this is when you started to see a pretty big sea change. Okay. So whether it be the Cistercians, who are most famous for Bernard of Clairvaux, or the Carthusians, who again still exist today, from under Bruno, you found some very strict religious orders, new rules, new religious orders coming into place. Okay. So this is the Carthusians. Bruno of Cologne, for example, in the 11th century, he creates a whole new concept of a monastery at Grande Chartreuse in 1084, and it was a total commitment to God. Okay. So it is, an extension of prayer, an extension of solitude, an extension of silence. Let's get away from everything and go back to that total commitment of God. So you see that with Bruno. You see it with the Cistercians. Cistercians were actually founded by 20 Benedictine monks that left the monastery that was slowly corrupting, to form the new order in Citeaux, and they did that in 1098. And they followed a strict Benedictine rule. So they went back to the original Benedictine rule. But again, they were no longer Benedictines. They separated themselves from Cluny, so they were no longer part of that order. And then what happens is Bernard de Clairvaux, okay, he is known as Bernard de Clairvaux eventually, but it's just Bernard when he joins the Cistercians and brings with him 30 of his family and friends. So there were about 20 Cistercians at the time, and he brought a group that more than doubled its size, which just shows you the power of Bernard and the attractiveness of Bernard. And they almost immediately had to open up a second Cistercian monastery, and they did that at Clairvaux, hence Bernard of Clairvaux. And then the Cistercians begin to grow, really based on the reputation of Bernard. Again, similar to the Carthusians, a very strict focus on God and support of God, a very strict focus on the original Benedictine rule. But now what you have is you have a dynamic personality that's very attractive, and really Cistercians start to dominate, despite the harshness of their rule, dominate Europe. So you're starting to see the Cluny monasteries start to fall down, and you're seeing the Cistercians rise. Although the Benedictines were still massive, don't get me wrong, but you see them, and then you see the Connecticut groups first rise. So the Norbertines, for example, this is when they came into life and took on the rule of Augustine. The Augustinians didn't exist yet. So this is just like you had monasteries following the rule of Benedict, but you didn't have Benedictines yet. Now you have monasteries following the rule of Augustine, because they're perfect for a canonicate, so canons regulars built around a large collegiate or cathedral church. And the Norbertines were just that. So, and all of a sudden, priests again dominating. And then, also what ends up happening is you have the beginnings of the Crusades, which means you also see the rise of some of the military orders, like the Templars or the Hospitallers, or some of some of those that were like the Teutonic orders. You also see the ransom orders rise, the Order of the Holy Trinity, the Order of Mercy. So these are orders that are focused on figuring out how to get captives back and freed from the slavery they've been subjected to during the Crusades. And eventually it evolved even further into ransoming people back who were taken into slavery by pirates. And, so all of a sudden you're seeing a whole different type of order evolve, and you're seeing a return to some of the original strictness of the religious orders through the Carthusians and the Cistercians. And again, you're seeing now the Canonicats really start to evolve, led by the Norbertines. So lots of change happening here in the 11th and 12th century. And you may say, well, so far you haven't really said much about women. Well, this is supposed to be talking about uh, male religious orders, but there's always been women here. Okay, as a matter of fact, the Norbertines are a good example. When they were first formed, they were a dual order. They were men and women. There were male and women Norbertines living in communities directly connected with each other. And that lasted until Norbert died, and people said, this isn't really working out for the obvious reasons. So let's segregate the women. Let's move them to a different location. And then eventually that turned into, and now let's not accept any more women into the Norbertine order. So the female Norbertine order actually just faded away, but it was there at the very beginning. Strangely enough, they're bringing it back now. So it actually exists in Europe, and from what I understand, will exist here in the United States shortly as well. So they're kind of returning to their roots in a way, about 900 years after the fact. So again, there were women. There were always women in female monasteries, but they were a different flavor. They certainly were dedicated. They're definitely pious people. But really, it was more of a holding place for single women until they were ready to be married. Okay. So they prayed the prayers, but it was still the domain of the rich. It was the place where you sent your daughter to keep her safe until marriage was appropriate. And that's kind of how they formed. They weren't taking a major role in the life of the church beyond their dedication to the prayer life, and the liturgy of the hours on behalf of the church, which is a contribution to say the least. So again, you have Bernard and Benedict. Bernard of Clairvaux withdraw from the world. Benedict certainly withdraw from the world. Well, now we have a major change that's about to happen. You have a new type of order, the Mendicants, who want to go out into the world and be dependent upon the world, which is an interesting twist. So let us now be part of the world and actually rely on the world for our sustenance. So let's go be fools for Christ. So this is a bold move, and we see it first with Francis of Assisi. But very quickly you start seeing a number of these mendicant orders form. So the Franciscans, the Dominicans, really same time period. But the Carmelites, now you have Augustinians for real, taking the rule of Augustine and applying it to a mendicant order. The Servites, so another example of an ancient order that we have right here in Orange County, which is odd. We have both the Norbertines and the Servites, who are two of the most ancient orders. The Minims, the Crutch Friars, the Friars of the Sack. So you have them rise to power, and meanwhile, in the rest of the real world, the church is struggling a little bit. You have papal prestige is really starting to fall apart. We have a little bit of papal corruption. So you have these mendicant orders rising just when they're kind of needed, because we have a pretty weak or very quickly weakening centralized church infrastructure. So it's funny how that happens. But really by the early 13th century, not only had these orders, specifically the Franciscans and the Dominicans, risen, but they grew into dominance very quickly. All right, very, very quickly. And strangely enough, the rule that they took on was the Augustinian rule. So not only did the Augustinians take on the Augustinian rule, and not only is the Augustinian rule used by the canons regulars like the Norbertines, Now you have both the Franciscans and the Dominicans taking on the rule of Augustine, at least as their foundational rule set. They added codices to it, no doubt, and they modified it. But it's just amazing how much that Augustinian rule got moved around from and influenced so many of the orders. They were dedicated, and this is where you see changes a little bit, dedicated to living more inside the world than outside of it. Poverty and orthodoxy are central to their thinking and their lifestyle. And you know, where they started as, at least with the Franciscans being very lay focused, they quickly migrated to being very clerically focused. So only because they realized what the world needed was better priests. And their answer was, we're become the better priests. And you saw that with both Dominic and Francis. Dominic, the order of preachers, and Francis, the Franciscans, they became the new priesthood. They became the Reformed priesthood, the trainers of priests for dioceses, so priests that worked out in the world. All right. And that rise again was rapid with lots of other groups. And one of the things that spurred them on was, because of the corruption in the church and the down or the loss of papal prestige. Really, what you started to see was you started to see some splinter groups forming within the Catholic Church. And the Waldensians probably came first. But then beyond them, some heretical groups. The Waldensians were not so much a heretical group as just a group that was illicit. The Waldensians really wanted to embrace the lifestyle of Jesus Christ, which was beautiful. But their preaching, was being done by uneducated, unformed men, and could often be quite far distant from Catholic purity. So the Waldensians were a problem. They had good intentions, but did not have the skills to manifest those intentions well. The Albigensians were clearly heretics. They were a version of the Manichaeans, a version of the Gnostics. They pop up and start to dominate in southern France. And something had to be done with these groups, these large groups that were really they were Catholics who were turning into something else, and they were doing much damage to the local Catholic Church by doing so, as they're bringing more and more people into their fold, including some bishops. So this became a problem, and the answer really was the mendicant orders in this. So first, the answer were the Cistercians. So the Pope, realizing how powerful the Cistercians are in Bernard, he calls on Bernard to see if he can deal with the Albigensians. But ultimately, it was the fact that the Albigensians and the Waldensians continued to succeed that Dominic formed his order to actually counteract them. Dominic realized the key to the success of both these groups were, preachers that looked more like Christ than the priests in the Catholic Church did. The priests in the Catholic Church are riding in their carriage and their gold and their silver and ornate everything. And these guys look like just what Christ is described as in the Gospels. And you're like, maybe I should be following the more Christ-like guy. And that's where Dominic said, how about we create an order of Christ-like preachers? And Francis said, yeah, let's really own our poverty. Let's make that something we're known from. So you end up having them, and other groups now fighting against the Albigensians and the Waldensians. Ultimately, a military crusade had to be called to weed out the Albigensians. So it ended in a pretty tragic way, but it helped give rise to these orders, which returned to the basics of the priesthood, and specifically all the mendicant orders. And then what you see in the 13th and 14th century now is a rise of what's called the second order. So now we're getting female orders associated with the male orders, not just female monasteries and cloisters, but now you're getting a second order Dominicans, second order Franciscans. You're even now getting third order. So, where you have religious sisters that are Dominicans, religious sisters that are Franciscans, Now you have lay people in the third order, men and women, who are continuing to live the lay lifestyle, but are also adopting some of the rules of these orders and supporting the charisms of these orders. So you're seeing the mendicant orders being the birthplace of the second orders, the religious sisters associated with the male orders, and the lay third orders, which now are starting to take hold throughout the high Middle Ages here, right? But and so things are going great with the mendicant orders, but as always, corruption comes in. Okay, so rapid rise, for example, the Franciscans brought in a problem. Okay, there were people that started to realize, well, we've accumulated a lot of stuff, and for an order that's not supposed to own anything, there's something not right here, and they wanted to go back to the original Franciscan rule of ordering nothing or owning nothing, when the rest of the Franciscans were being realistic, saying, well, we're now major players in the university system. We can't just not have a university and expect people to come to a nothing where we can teach them. There needs to be a building. So you had a little bit of a dispute, and that actually rose to a split or resulted in a split in the Franciscan orders, first between what are known as the spirituals, who wanted to go back to more of the strict Franciscan lifestyle, and the conventuals, who want to say, hey, we still are dedicated to poverty, but having physical assets is a necessity for us to do exercise our charism of teaching, for example, or medical support, for example, in the real world. Eventually, those conventionals split again. So you had the spirituals and the conventionals. The spirituals eventually faded, but the conventionals split again into the blacks and the browns. The brown Franciscans being the observance, so more Francis oriented, and the blacks being more of the conventional, Franciscans that didn't want to follow the strict rule of no ownership. And then eventually you get the Capuchins. So Padre Pio's group, they evolve as really the new spirituals, okay? And strangely enough, they were more of a synthesis between the black and the brown, and they wore gray as a result. So an undyed cloth, all right? So a lot happens there. With the rise of the second orders and the third orders and the troubles, and with that always follow massive growth that for example the Franciscans dealt with. Dominicans weren't exempt from that. They had to deal with it as well. And this is all in a very interesting time of the world. Again, you see that we have the Babylon captivity of the papacy. You have the Great Western Schism, when we had multiple popes. You also have a major event, the Black Death, where a third of the Western population dies, okay, between 1350 and 1450. So this is crazy. This is 25 million people out of 75 million estimated inhabitants of Europe are gone because of the Black Death. That had a huge impact on monasteries, both those that were independent and those that had orders, because they were not immune to the Black Death. And unfortunately, they paid a heavier price, because since they stayed so isolated and living in such tight communities, it would spread rapidly in the community. So we ended up losing a lot of our religious brothers and sisters to the Black Death. And since they were also, you had the mendicant orders that were focused on service, they turned a lot of their service to hospital service and supporting the sick. And the more sick you support, the more likely you're going to be sick. So lots happening here at the same time. You have the Black Death. You have really the downfall of the papacy, or at least the severe damage to the papacy's or the view of the papacy in the world, and its prestige and power. And you also have the age of discovery. You realize that wow, there's a whole nother world out there, okay? And it's called the New World. And all of a sudden, we need to figure out how we're going to manage this. So you have the Treaty of Tordesillas. This is where the Pope basically split the New World up and gave the East to the Portuguese and the West to the Spanish. Hence, you have the way South America falls. Brazil is the beginning of the East. So Brazil and everything around to the Near East and Far East is Portuguese. And then really, once you get into the Western Pacific, we're back into the West. So the Philippines and everything into the rest of South America and Mexico become the Spanish. And you got to see how that evolution occurred. And that gave rise to another change. The orders are like, wow, we got to go out and help. And so they became missionaries for the first time. And it's interesting because they had never done this before in a world that was where Christianity was unknown. They had served as missionaries in Europe and Africa, but in both those locations, people knew what Christianity was. So when they get to the New World, it's a whole new ball game, and they're not actually well prepared for it, strangely enough. They're out there, dealing with the fact that there's work to be done in trying to apply the methods that they had always used, but it took a long time for both specifically the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who were first on the ground, and later the Jesuits, to figure out how to be evangelists in brand new virgin mission territory where Christianity never existed at all. So again, the 16th century is where you see the beginning of this with the Franciscans really going into South America, and then again quickly followed by Dominicans, and then shortly after the creation of the Jesuits, they're out there as well. So 16th century, which is where we end on this particular part of the timeline. We also obviously realize that was the beginning of the Reformation. So the revolution, the splitting up of Christendom between Protestant and Catholic. And again, that also we had the Black Death, which damaged the orders quite a bit, took away a lot of their membership. Well, the Reformation took away a lot more, and actually ended up in the destruction of a lot of monasteries, because anywhere that became Protestant dominated clearly did not want Catholic religious orders or Catholic monasteries in their region. So very quickly, many monasteries were closed down, and monks, female and male, were exiled, and you had a lot of turmoil, and it was a difficult time during that next century. You know, the 16th century into the 17th century, the wars of religion just became a really difficult time. Okay, you did end up having some new developments, oratories like under Philip Neri, confraternities, lay religious institutes, the clerical religious institutes. They started to emerge, taking simple vows, living in the cities, not necessarily in community, but starting a different type of religious life, which exists to this day. Um, uh, you know, uh, Exists to this day. We're starting to form. So you're starting to see a greater variety of this religious life now, beyond just the community, the isolation, and the religious orders. This is when we get our friend Ignatius of Loyola. Okay, so born in the late 15th, but lived through the mid 16th century. Formed the Jesuits in 1540. So the idea here is let's actually be warriors for Jesus. So Ignatius was a military man himself, and he wanted to get together a group of men that were actually going to be out there and on mission. And now we have a total different focus. Instead of being cloistered and isolated and contemplative, and instead of being active like the mendicants, but still living in that lifetime, or that community lifestyle, let's now actually have no home base. Let's be an order, a fraternity of men that really are warriors, built to go where they're needed at a moment's notice, with no centralized location. So another major innovation is what the Jesuits brought to the table. They were very quickly, quickly embraced by the Pope, because they pledged their strict obedience to the Pope and put themselves at his disposal. So basically what you had is that, orders had always pledged to the Pope, but now you have an order that is completely dedicated to the Pope and are telling the Pope, you can tell us what to do. And the Pope did. Okay, the Pope said, this is a good idea. I'm going to use these guys. And he actually promoted the Jesuit spread, and it spread very rapidly. And the Jesuits were sent out. They were sent out to multiple countries. They became advisors to kings and queens everywhere. They became educators. They led a lot of the missionary activity and the second wave of missionary activity. The Jesuits became a tour de force around the world, going wherever the Pope saw a need to fill gaps. And they filled many, many gaps, but became primarily massive in the world of education, especially higher education. So that was a way that the Pope saw as influencing the entire religious community by actually making sure that the education of the religious and even the non-religious lay people would be very focused on Christian orthodoxy. So a kind of a response to the Reformation, the Jesuits kind of filled that gap as well. And then you also, at the end of the 16th century, mid to end, you see the emergence of, Teresa of Avila. So we had the second order Dominicans and Franciscans now for a couple of centuries, and women are now playing a much more active role. And these female religious orders are now truly acting as religious orders. But what you have with Teresa of Avila is something unique in that, she was a Carmelite. Carmelites are a mendicant order, so she was a second order Carmelite, and her convent, her monastery was, as corrupt as some of the others had become over time again. And she saw that, and she didn't care. Okay, so for 20 years, she was like every other nun. She was having a pretty good time. She was known to be a social butterfly. Apparently, she was quite attractive, and had some sense of a social life, although that's a little bit of a rumor. But we do know that the people in her convent who were supposed to be cloistered sisters were often found outside of the convent. So the cloister was not fully functioning there. But, she ends up having a mystical experience. And these visions began, I think she was in her 40s when they began, that basically, were asking her to help reform the Carmelite order. But it was interesting. It wasn't just help reform the female Carmelite order, reform the whole thing. So here you have a woman who starts to push for reform in her own order, an order that she was equally corrupt in, and now all of a sudden is the greatest Protestant Carmelite of all time. So she is living by example, but she is leading a reform in the female side of the Carmelites. She finds herself a partner in crime in St. John of the Cross on the male side, and she ends up pushing through John a reform on the male side of the Carmelite order as well. So her quote, I believe, is on the next page. Yes. She is very famous for this quote: "What would become of the world if God did not spare it for the sake of those who consecrated themselves to him in religious orders? God has mercy on Christendom for the sake of monks and nuns who are making atonement or withdrawn from the world in order to better intercede for it." So in one of her visions that she was given, it was shown to her that the only reason the world continued was because of the work of the religious orders over the centuries in praying for the world's forgiveness and praying for the world's reform and repentance. Apparently, she was given an insight that actually that's the only reason that the end of time has not yet come, is that the orders have been effective through their prayers and through the actions they've taken to help build the kingdom of God, in allowing that kingdom to continue to move forward. So it's very interesting and striking to think about that, because the religious orders for most of us, especially the contemplative orders, are invisible to us. We don't even think of them. And even the active ones, we don't think that much about. We just wonder why they dress funny. And quite frankly, if Teresa is to be accounted as valid, we owe quite a bit to the order's existence, more than we will probably ever know until the end of time. So we get to the 17th and 18th century. 17th century, the wars of religion are continuing, but now people are over it. They're starting to wind down. We're starting to see confessionalism fall into place, and this just means where the world is starting to get cut up into Protestant territory and Catholic territory, and let's agree not to fight each other. And if you're living in a Protestant territory, you have to be Protestant, otherwise move to a Catholic territory. And let's stop the wars and just segregate ourselves so we don't kill each other. Okay. So you start to see that again. That certainly damaged the religious orders, because as you had that segregation, it meant orders had to move, and it was disruptive. But it was a way to end those religious wars. Again, the ancient orders really struggling because they had lost so much property and so many people. So ancient monasteries were collapsing. The mendicant orders were still out there and working and thriving, especially in the New World, and in the major cities in Europe that were still Catholic. But some of the more ancient orders really started to hurt. And a lot of it was because of what happened with the Reformation and the sort of split between the Protestant and the Catholic world. And property's lost, interest is lost. It became a tough time. However, by the middle of the 18th century, they had regrouped a little bit. Okay, so once everything had settled down and these wars had ended, and you kind of could see where Catholicism was thriving, and actually Catholicism started making a comeback. The Counter-Reformation really kicked in, and even though we had lost a lot of people to Protestantism, now that those lines were starting to reverse again, and now you have all these new Catholics in the New World. And for the 10 million Catholics we lost in Europe, we got 10 million back in Mexico. And so you're starting to see a change by the mid 18th century. And you start to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is then quickly destroyed, okay, as nation states are starting to form. And the university systems have done a great job. We have much more, high degree of literacy throughout Europe, which means you have a high degree of intellectual thought, not all of it very good, okay? And you also have, when you have a high degree of intellectual thought and high degree of literacy, you also tend to have an erosion of trust of institutions. This is nothing new. This didn't just happen in the 1960s. It happened long before that. And, people started to look at the religious orders with suspicion, and one that they came under a lot of suspicion were the Jesuits. And the reason is the Jesuits seem to be everywhere. They seem to be controlling education. And people started to wonder, wait a second, these guys are actually, advisors to kings and queens, and they're confessors to the rich and famous and the aristocracy. They have all the inside dirt on everyone. They're educating everyone's kids, at least from the aristocracy and the middle class. These guys are actually too much, having too great an influence on the next generations. We need to do something. So it started with Portugal. Portugal was the first country to say enough with the Jesuits, and they expelled them. Well, that then spilled over to Spain, and then that spilled over to France. And that, next thing you know, you have three major European countries or nation states, which are fairly newly formed, having expelled the Jesuits. You have a bunch of Jesuits now in exile in Rome, okay, in Italy, but really in around Rome, walking around with nothing to do. It gets a little ugly, okay. So the Jesuits really started to fall into and not through things they did necessarily. I think they're a victim of circumstance. Fall into a place where people want them gone, okay. And unfortunately, the papacy was still pretty weak. And so some pressure came on the papacy to disband the Jesuits. And a couple of popes resisted that, but eventually, Pope Clement XIV, he succumbed to that pressure. which really came from both the secular world, who didn't like the influence of the Jesuits, and strangely enough, from the other religious orders, who didn't like the influence of the Jesuits. So the Jesuits kind of got clobbered from inside and out. And what you end up having is they're suppressed. Strangely enough, you suppress what was at that point the largest religious order. That leaves a pretty big vacuum. Okay, there was one place that did not acknowledge the papacy's suppression of the Jesuits, and that was Russia. So Catholic Russia, yes, there was a thing called Catholic Russia, was like a haven for Jesuits. So Jesuits migrated there, and they were allowed to continue to exist and work and do their good things there. And quite frankly, Russia's response was, if we get rid of the Jesuits, we get rid of our educational system. Why would we possibly do that? So, even though they were suppressed, they continued to exist. And the rest of the orders thought suppression of the Jesuits would be a good idea. Unfortunately, they realized that, wait a second, the Jesuits are responsible for holding quite a few of the lines that we needed to hold. And part of their suppression actually influenced the development of what would become the French Revolution. So, the independent thinking and the loss of the Jesuit influence in the major universities. And next thing you know, you have this thinking of, hey, we don't need anybody, any institution. We don't need the church. And the French Revolution occurs, and the ideas of the French Revolution, as a society of humanists, where we no longer need God because we've evolved to the point where we are our own gods, and freedom is the freedom to do whatever you want when you want without restriction. It's not freedom to become the best version of yourself. And things got really ugly at the end of the 18th century. So that obviously it didn't last long, that tremendous ugliness, but it was problematic, and it affected all the orders, and it spread from France to Italy to Spain to Portugal to the UK. A lot of that Enlightenment thinking for about a 50 to 75 year period was dominating the space, and religion suffered terribly, and religious orders suffered the most. So you had another, really a major exodus from the orders, and major confiscation of goods and locations, and the orders tend to both lead us and pay the price when things go bad. So that brings us to the next couple of centuries, and the quote here is a quote from one of the references that I will give you. Vatican II, so obviously we're going to get into the 20th century, gives the impression that the specialness that orders had been viewed with was not all that special. Religious life was just one of many vocational paths one could take. Other life paths were just as good. As we get into the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st century, this became a dominant line of thinking. So, people had always looked, since the end of the martyrdom, major martyrdom periods, and the legalization, eventually the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the empire, they always looked at the religious orders with a sense of awe, whether you agreed with them or not, or even particularly liked them or not. You had to respect their commitment to their way of life. And now all of a sudden we're getting to the point where, people are like, there's other ways to serve God, and who's to say that this is better than any other way? So that line of thinking started to evolve in the 19th century, certainly carried over into the 20th. So early 19th century, though, we do have some good news for the Jesuits. They get reinstated. We also get some good news for Christianity in general, as France goes from being the destructor of the church to the constructor of the church. So France, after the fall of Napoleon, I guess, in the early 19th century, completely spun back towards the church, and actually became the place where religious orders could expect some protection. And so you had a massive growth in religious orders in France again, even though it was France that had basically destroyed them a century earlier. And strangely enough, at one point in the mid 19th century, France is actually sending out one of every two missionaries. So think about that. Missionaries being sent all over the world. 50% of them are coming from France at this point. So France has come full circle once again, and is the favored nation of the church. We see a dramatic rise at the same time in women's orders, and primarily because the destruction of the orders in the previous century had left such a hole in education and medical care, that women religious saw an opportunity to fill that void, and they did. They filled it quite nicely. And so again, Napoleon abdicates in 1815. The Western nation states are starting to take final form in the 19th century. As a matter of fact, the papal states are finally, incorporated into the new nation state of Italy in 1870. A lot is happening there. Women's orders are filling the void from the destroyed men's orders. So even though the Jesuits are reinstated, they're not quite in the position they were in before. The other orders are all growing, but again, female religious really jumped in and took the bull by the horns here in the 19th and 20th century. As a matter of fact, everything was going great for the religious orders, female religious orders and male religious orders, right up until that 1950 to 1970 period, the social and sexual revolution, where you had a total loss of faith in any institution whatsoever, and established structures were seen as a restriction, and looked at with contempt or at least concern. So 1950, at that point, we had 1 million religious sisters, 300 religious brothers throughout the world. In the midst of this, we have Vatican II. Vatican II does indeed not throw shade on religious orders, not intentionally, but unintentionally it did, because it did actually start talking about the value of lay life, because it was trying to emphasize the value of the family unit, because they saw what was happening with the destruction of the family unit. But in putting that emphasis on lay life and married life and the life of the worker, the individual single worker, they actually took a unintended swat at the religious orders, and people in the religious orders were kind of like, why would I stay in this if this isn't a major benefit to the church, and there's other ways to live. I can dedicate myself to God through these other means. You know what? I'm gonna go and do that. So you started seeing this massive decline in religious orders in the mid 20th century. But we get to the 21st century, we've lost 70% of the religious brothers in the world, so we're down to 52,000. It's tough. And 35% of the religious sisters, which in the United States, it was much deeper cuts. In the United States, it was close to 80% of the religious sisters, and a little bit less of the religious brothers. The religious orders, male religious orders, survived better here. So the United States was sort of an outlier. But with this, you had a bunch of new forms exploding. So again, the lay congregations and clerical congregations and the secular institutes, which had evolved earlier in the early modern period, but now they're just exploding. Okay, as people are seeing that message from Vatican II that there's many ways to service God, as both a lay and clerical person. And people are taking advantage of that. So much that today there's more of these organizations than there ever were before. There may be fewer people in them, but there's certainly a greater variety of them. So with that, let's just wrap up with, I know it's a lot, and that was a quick run through. Let's wrap up with, the final impact. And, we can be reminded that Teresa tells us that the impact that we didn't see was massive. But let's talk about the impact we did see. So, human salvation through prayer, preservation of orthodoxy, religious education and catechesis. This is what the religious orders did, okay? Priestly formation. If it wasn't for the religious orders, we would never been able to solve our poorly formed priest problem. And quite frankly, religious orders today continue to play an active role in the proper formation of priests. So It is a role that they embraced in the late Middle Ages and certainly in the Counter-Reformation period. And it's a role they continue to serve at today. Missionaries, this is the religious orders were the boots on the ground. They were the first ones to get there, and they're still there today. And they're the first ones that are called when we need a new mission. So always been there. And then models of discipleship. They've always served as an inspiration to the rest of the world, regardless of what Vatican II unfortunately did to that view. If you really study what these orders do and the commitment they make to the service of God, you can't help but admire them, and you can't help but have that dream of, could I do that? Okay, could I be that committed to God and to the world that I could, really sacrifice so much of myself for love of God, for prayer, for love of humanity? And that's an interesting question. So again, great models, they continue to be. From a civilization impact, there's been countless books written on this, okay? People have recognized that the religious orders, had they not existed, had these monasteries not become storehouses of knowledge and copyists of great literature, we would have lost much of Western history and Western literature and culture, but they preserved it, okay? So that when we emerged from the low Middle Ages into the Middle Ages and then the High Middle Ages, we could leverage that preservation to start to grow in the areas of science and literature once again, because they had preserved what had come before. Something that very few people remember about the religious orders is they were the masters of agricultural development. So one of the problems that we started having prior to the Black Death was we had a population explosion and not enough food. So you had severe hunger issues, and a lot of the religious orders focused on that by developing new means of agricultural cultivation and new equipment, new theories, and they studied it and used science to figure out what was the best way to maximize crop growth. Then the Black Death comes. And following the Black Death, it only took 100 years to replace that population because people started having kids like there was no tomorrow. And then we had even a worse problem. So again, agricultural development was key, both pre and post Black Death. Science and technology development, if you go back to the history of the scientific revolution, it is populated with religious brothers and clerics. It's just amazing. And a lot of it had to do with this dedication to both the development of your spiritual and intellectual life. That was part of the rules, was you had to do this. Where in the secular world, you didn't have time to do that. So it was natural that your science and technology development came out of the orders that were physically dedicating time because they had eliminated all other material concerns to the development of knowledge, which, they obviously then also became our primary educators. They also became our primary hospital workers and were really the primary form of nursing care up until the 1990s. Okay, so still a dominant player in hospital workers and nursing care, but through the 90s they were not just the dominant, they were the only show in town. And then certainly the years and years, centuries of services, especially the mendicant orders that have been offered through them to the poor and middle class. So those active orders getting out into the world and really living the life of beatitude, helping those, feeding the poor, housing the homeless. This is the impact that these religious orders had, and it really can't be underestimated. And good. I could probably go on, and again, I crammed a lot more in there than I really intended to, but there's just so much. I think I have, close to 200 pages of notes on my orders research. I could have given you so many great stories, but I just wanted to, at least get through and give you a major overview as best I could. I would recommend a number of books. These are three that are really helpful. Okay, so Elizabeth Rapley, "The Lord Is Their Portion," the story of religious orders and how they shaped our world. Really excellent, actually. There's certainly some worldview overlays her approach and her telling the story. But that's the case with all historians. It's hard to escape your worldview. But I think it's an excellent and pretty comprehensive history. Walter Nig's "Warriors of God," the great religious orders, excellent and beautiful. You're not going to hear about all the orders. You're going to hear about the major religious orders, but a lot of the material that I have is cultivated from that book. And then Warren H. Carroll's "History of Christendom," all 6 volumes have elements of the story of the religious orders in them. Carroll does a great job of weaving the role of religious orders into the history of Christendom. So if you happen to have that set, it's a 18-inch wide volume set, so it's a lot of history. But if you're looking for particular information, you're going to find something about every order that ever exists. There's so many I'd even mention. So many of the big ones, like the Salesians or what have you, I'd even mention here today. You're getting a little bit of everything from them. And then if you're looking for specific information on a specific order, I'd always recommend the New Advent site. So newadvent.com. And you can just click on the letter of the beginning of an order. So it's really the Catholic Encyclopedia online, at least the 1913 version. So it's a little outdated, but you can get some tremendously well done research on religious orders, especially the ones that predate the 20th century, through New Advent. So just throwing that out there. And then with that, again, normally questions online, no questions for you. So I think I am done. I thank you for this. I know it went a little bit longer than expected, but there's a lot here, and hopefully you realize just how much there is and how interesting this is. And if you're really looking for, something to really just amaze you, it would not hurt to go take a real good look at the Carthusians. And you can read about the Carthusian monastery in Vermont, and you can actually see how they live their life. It has quite a few pictures on it and good descriptions of their daily life. And I think it will amaze you that there are men that are living this way of life in this type of isolation, total dedication and commitment to a life connected to God and one of prayer, and giving the world its gift of prayer and interceding on behalf of the world. So just wonderful. I'm a big fan of the Carthusians now. I'll probably continue to support them financially just out of amazement of what they do. And hopefully you'll see some of the amazement in that as well. Let us end in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you again for all the men and women through history who have dedicated their life to you and to the betterment of your kingdom, which means for the betterment of the rest of us in the body of Christ. Let them continue to thrive. Let them continue to grow. Let great leaders emerge, and great excitement be built around them. Let's, constantly help us remember that this way of life is an amazing way of life and is an opportunity for our children to not just solidify their own eternal lives, but to help the rest of the world in a real tangible way. Let us not forget that and keep that in the front of mind for our children as a lifestyle choice. And we just also ask that, as the orders continue to exist and go through what are the inevitable cycles of growth, followed by corruption, followed by reform, that the reformers are raised, that need to be raised at the right time, and that the orders continue to exist as they emerge on the other side of that reform cycle, and can continue to do their good work for us. And we ask this all in your holy name. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.